you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here's the video that you came here for. But let's stick with the basketball stuff because obviously with the Chris Beard, Texas stuff, there are really two sides to this story. There's what has already happened and what will happen for Chris Beard. We just discussed that. But then there's also what will happen at Texas going forward. Texas at some point is going to have to hire a new head coach. And so what I would say is let's get into the Texas situation, because what I think about Texas, this could be potentially one of the most fascinating coaching searches that we have seen in a while, because the Texas job, I believe, is actually one of the best jobs in college basketball. And I would argue that it's actually gotten better since Chris Beard took the job 2 years ago before this obvious serious situation that led to his firing on Thursday. And so I know what probably some of you are thinking. You're driving around, you're at the gym, you're doing this, you're doing that. You're sitting there saying, Torres, how could you say that Texas is one of the best jobs in the country? Well, I'm saying it because it is. Now, look, is it better than Kentucky? Is it better than Carolina? Is it better than Kansas, Duke? Probably not. But I think you ask most people in the sport of basketball, they will tell you Texas is probably one of the top 7 to 10 jobs in college basketball, and it's for two reasons. One, and we talk about this all the time, it is because the school will give you every resource needed to compete at the highest level. And we talk about this all the time, and it's super important, right? Coaches at the highest level, they just want to know that they are competing on the most even playing field they can be, right? Whether it's facilities, resources, recruiting budget, private jets, NIL in this world. Remember, we talked about it with Lane Kiffin when he was considering the Auburn job. I said, I don't think he's leaving for Auburn. But what you can't deny is that in this world, in the NIL world, Auburn will provide Lane Kiffin more to compete at the highest level than Ole Miss will. Now, he decided to stay at Ole Miss, but it doesn't change that fact. And so when you look at Texas, even in basketball, Texas gives its coach everything needed to compete. Facilities, again, private planes. I don't mean to, take anyone too far behind the scenes, but I've seen Chris Beard at these AAU events. He comes in, comes out, private jets, can get to wherever he needs to go. Whatever was needed at that time prior to his firing, he had it at his disposal. How about this? Just think about that. Remember that story about Arch Manning's recruiting weekend at Texas? They spent close to $300,000 on that recruiting weekend. Now, it wasn't just for him, but it was for a bunch of prospects. But I only bring it up to say, if you're going to spend $300,000 on a recruiting weekend for football, I'm pretty sure the basketball coach can call up the AD and ask for pretty much anything. And as long as the coach is winning, that basketball coach is going to get what he wants. And so it's already a good job. It's worth noting the other reason that I believe it's one of the best jobs in the country, and this is why it's such a coveted job. There are so many good players in the state of Texas, right? Think about, everyone thinks of New York City or Chicago as kind of the mecca of basketball. Think about all of the great players that have come out of Texas in the last 10 years. And I think Texas is now producing more high-level players than maybe anywhere. Cade Cunningham, Tyrese Maxey. In college basketball right now, Cason Wallace at Kentucky, Anthony Black at Arkansas, Jordan Walsh at Arkansas, Dylan Mitchell, who is at Texas right now, all of them former McDonald's All-Americans. RJ Hampton is from the Dallas area, was a first-round pick of the Orlando Magic a few years ago. You want to go back a few years more, Julius Randle, the Harrison twins. The number of high-level athletes that come out of Texas right now is unbelievable. And so that's what's made Texas a great job. Now you add that in an NIL world, I don't believe that Texas is getting left behind. And you add in the fact that Texas is now going to the SEC with SEC basketball money or SEC TV money. And I believe this could be one of the craziest coaching searches we've ever seen. Because if Texas wants to break the bank and do the Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley thing and just throw so much money at an established head coach that they can't say no, I think it completely changes the paradigm of who they can potentially get, especially in a world where we know that the Big 12, the Pac-12, the ACC, the Big East, they can't compete. If Texas just writes a blank check, those conferences can't compete financially with the schools now in the SEC and the Big Ten. And so I've beat around the bush enough. Let me get to a few candidates that I've kind of just heard their names bandied about. I think some are more realistic than others. One, I haven't heard anybody else mention this besides me, but I think he would pick up the call if you offered him enough money. That's Scott Drew at Baylor. And I know it sounds crazy. He just won a national championship, got a number 1 seed last year, but let me explain why I think Scott Drew would pick up the call from Texas. And by the way, how crazy would it be if Texas just hired the Texas Tech basketball coach and Chris Beard a few years ago, and then went and got another established Big 12 coach within the state? But why I believe Scott Drew would at least listen is a few reasons. One, his name has been linked to other jobs before. In previous years, this was all prior to the national championship, but his name was linked to other jobs. And it was kind of known in the industry that he was kind of willing to listen and that he wasn't like attached to Baylor for the rest of his career. Now, that may have changed with the national championship. And the one thing with any private school, we don't know exactly how much that he is making at Baylor, but I think it's worth considering. I'll tell you this. I watched Baylor the other night. They were playing TCU, top 20 matchup in the Big 12. That arena was far from full. And so if you can't, as one of the elite programs in college basketball with the top 20 team from your own state, fill up that arena, I think Scott Drew might have to sit back and wonder, is there one more stop for me in college basketball? He's only 52 years old. He's probably got another 15 to 20 years if he wants it. And I am not sold that he is definitively going to retire at Baylor. Now, I think he might, but listen, we got a lot of Kentucky fans that listen to this show. I know that they think that they could get Scott Drew if he was ever available. And so I'm not sold that he's going to finish his career there. And I think what I just said about the NIL post Big Ten SEC world is something that we have to consider. Now, even after Texas and Oklahoma leave, the Big 12 was probably going to be the best conference in college basketball. But again, we know that financially they're not going to be competing on the same level as the SEC and the Big Ten. And so I do wonder, what is there something that Baylor will not be able to offer Scott Drew that Texas will? Because Texas can offer anything. Texas can offer a baseline salary that makes him the highest paid coach in college basketball. They could offer him a 10-year, 5-year, $50 million contract, $10 million a year, 7 years, $70 million, whatever. They could do it. They could offer him every resource. They could offer him the best NIL program in America. I don't know if Baylor is going to be able to compete in the future where, let's be honest, we're going to be paying for players above board. And so I think Scott Drew probably listens to that call if you call. Now, he's not going through the interview process. He's not letting his name get dragged out over weeks as you pick apart all of the candidates. And I think you probably have to make him the highest paid coach in college basketball to get him to that job. But again, you call up Scott Drew after the season, you say 7 years, $70 million guaranteed. I think he probably takes the job. And I think he's a guy that is probably not going to be named in a lot of these lists that I think you at least have to consider. And again, that's without knowing exactly what his contract looks like. He's at a private school. Some of these guys we'll get to in a minute. They have prohibitive buyouts. Scott Drew is a guy that I would absolutely think would at least consider the offer. Another guy that I think would consider it is Brad Underwood in Illinois. Brad Underwood, for people who do not know, really kind of has a more Midwest, Southwest history to him than he does in the Midwest. Now he's in, I think, year 5, year 6, maybe at Illinois. But this was a guy that came up in the junior college ranks, started at Kansas State, which is obviously Big 12 country in terms of being an assistant coach. Then he was the head coach at Stephen F. Austin. Then, of course, he was the head coach at Oklahoma State in the Big 12. And I think he's always felt more more Texas than he has Illinois, more Southwest than he has Chicago. And I think he'd at least listen to this one as well. Now, the problem with Brad Underwood is a couple things. One, he is a little bit older. I looked it up. I think he's 59 years old. I could do a quick search while you guys and girls wait. But the other thing with Brad Underwood, in addition to his age, which as I'm looking up right now, bad radio, he is 59 years old. He will be 60 early next year. Is that on top of that is that it's late next year, December of 2023. So he just turned 59. He'll be 60 next year. But on top of that, and I think this is something to consider as well, is that he does have a pretty big buyout. So he signed a contract extension last year But prior to that, his buyout was $9 million. Generally, the way this stuff works, your buyout doesn't go down when you sign a new contract, it goes up. So I think the buyout might be a little bit prohibitive, but again, it's Texas. If they want to make the move, if they think he's the guy, they can write that check. And speaking of which, that brings me to the next candidate, who I don't know what his prerogative is, but he's got a big buyout, but I think Texas could make it happen. That's Nate Oats at Alabama. And it's funny, right? Because every time a job opens, I think everybody puts Nate Oats atop of these lists because they say, well, this job's better than Alabama. That job's better than Alabama. Well, the bottom line with Nate Oats is this. As great as he is, he has, after this season, a $9 million buyout on his contract. And so that, to me, feels very important because you are going to have to pay a lot of money just to speak with Nate Oats, let alone what you're going to have to pay him in salary, let alone everything else. But there's two things that stand out that make me think that if you're willing to pay that big buyout, Nate Oats may consider a move. One, first of all, I think he just checks all the boxes. He's pretty young. He's about 50 years old. So, you have him for a long time. This is not, we'll talk about some other guys, but Nate Oats is actually 48 years old. He won't even be, he just turned 48. You hire Nate Oats, you could potentially keep him for another 20 years. And two, the one thing I will say, and this is a conversation in Alabama basketball circles, this isn't me talking out of my you-know-what. I think there's a belief that while I said that Texas is giving Chris Beard everything that he needs to compete at the highest level, I think there's a belief that Nate Oats is not getting that at Alabama. Now, that's not a criticism of Greg Byrne. I respect Greg Byrne. But there's been talk for a while that Alabama needs to upgrade its basketball arena, Coleman Coliseum. And apparently they've been slow to kind of get things moving on a new arena. Well, Texas just opened up a new arena. Texas showed its commitment to basketball. If Alabama drags its feet, does Nate Oats listen? I think he might. And I'd mention this as well. Again, he checks all the boxes. This Alabama team is really good. Like, I think they'll probably beat Kentucky this weekend, a game that I'm sure we'll talk about on Monday's show. If he goes to a Final Four, if he goes to an Elite Eight, if he wins another SEC, I think you got to at least call. You see if you could pay Bama that $9 million, I think you at least consider. Another guy in the SEC that's linked to all these jobs, Eric Musselman. Now, Musselman's a little bit different on a positive and a negative. One, I don't think there's anything that he isn't being given at Arkansas that other coaches are given, okay? Best facilities, best resources, best travel, best this, best that. The only thing with Eric Musselman is, unless I'm misreading it, his buyout after this season is only $2 million. And so there is very much a scenario. You can get him out of that contract. Nate Oats, I don't know that you can get Nate Oats out of that contract. But Eric Musselman, I think you can get Coach Muss out of that contract. Arkansas, we know how great he's been there. And I think that Arkansas is a great job. And I don't think I never asked him. I don't think he would leave. But I'm telling you, if you're Arkansas, if you're Hunter Yurachek, you better get a new contract signed because that $2 million buyout will not stop Texas from pursuing Eric Musselman. Unless, again, maybe I misread the contract details, but I think it was about $8 million buyout prior to last offseason. It's like $2 million right now. Worth considering. Couple long shots. I don't think like Dennis Gates is all of a sudden now a hot name with what he's doing at Missouri. It feels a little bit too early for that. I saw somebody mention Jerome Tang, what he's doing, the first-year head coach at Kansas State. It feels a little premature for that. Now, he could go back to Baylor if Scott Drew were interested in that job. But those are a couple long shots, and I think there's two other quick ones that I think have to be considered or at least discussed. One, I think Rodney Terry, the current interim head coach, he could coach his way into this job. Now, I think it's going to be tough to keep this group together and locked in, because, again, there's a lot coming at those players right now. But if he gets this team to a Big 12 regular season title, if he gets them to a Big 12 tournament title, if he gets them to an Elite Eight, to a Final Four, all things that this group is capable of, you have to think that he would be considered and would get that job. Now, it's a tough task ahead of him, but as I said, they're 5-1 since he took over. He can now go to that locker room and say, we have closure. We're ready to move on. I'm the guy. We'll see that. And then finally, let me just say this. My buddy Nick Coffey, and I love Nick, so I'm not putting this on him totally, but he brought up an interesting point. Kentucky fans are trying to force John Calipari out right now. They're tired of everything that has become of the Calipari era. We know that Calipari keeps notes on everybody. Does Calipari at least flirt with this job? And by the way, would Texas be interested in him, vice versa? Does Calipari flirt with these guys and just say, look, Kentucky, you guys don't appreciate me. You don't like me. That's fine. I'm ready to move on. You guys are ready to move on from me. Let's see if you're really ready to move on from me and at least flirt. I don't think it's going to happen, but I thought it was interesting. Cal's getting a lot of flack and a lot of pushback. I don't think they're beating Alabama this weekend. Is there a scenario where he gets some pushback on that? And I think that's it. We'll obviously keep you updated on this coaching job as things continue to progress. But I'll tell you, I think there are some real candidates. And I think this could be the first crazy coaching search we've seen in a while. Again, my buddy Nick Coffey brought it up. You think about all the jobs that have opened the last couple of years. North Carolina wasn't really much of a search. They just, promoted Hubert Davis. Same with Duke, promoted John Shire. Arizona, they locked in on Tommy Lloyd early. There wasn't much of a search. Indiana was the opposite. They couldn't get anybody interested. They got Mike Woodson. This is the one. I think there's some people that are probably interested that we're not thinking about because of the players, because of the resources, because of the facilities. I don't know who that guy is. I think they get somebody interesting. And then I would add on top of this, if they want to break the bank, if they want to pay crazy money, they can get just about anybody and they have the money to do it.